Hello everyone, welcome back to On the Fly. Today we're bringing you part 2 of our 19-part series where we break down each nation's international hockey season. Today's topic will be Team Canada, but before we get too far into it today, a quick reminder that we did post our Team USA recap last week. As well, you can be on the lookout for Team Sweden and Team Finland coming in the next 2 Sundays from now, so stay tuned for that. But let's talk about Team Canada. And this Canadian team this year was in some ways a disappointment. Yes, they won some of the more quote-unquote minor tournaments, but I think when you look at sort of the big three, a disappointing year for the Canadians. You look at the World Juniors, the Men's Worlds, and the Women's Worlds, kind of your big three tournaments. And the Men's Worlds this year, a quarterfinal exit. The World Juniors, a quarterfinal exit, and not a gold at the Women's Worlds, which in many ways is a very big disappointment for the Canadians. So I think when we look at it, this Canadian team this year especially was one that just couldn't really get their feet going. And I think it all kicks off with the World Juniors. And we'll start here, of course, with an impressive victory for this Canadian team at this year's World Juniors, where they beat Finland 4-0. And not only was it a 4-0 win over a tough Finnish team, but it was a decisive win. And I think you looked at it kind of with all the storylines coming in to this tournament for the Canadian team. A lot of people left off the roster. Were they going to be able to score goals? Did they have the defensive capacity to do it? And sure enough, they come out and they play a very distinct Canadian winning way, beating the Finns 4-0. And I thought this was a really good start for this Canadian team. And unfortunately, from there, it didn't really carry. And that game, I'd argue, was the best Canada played the entire tournament. And you kind of look at the pre-tournament as well, where the lead-up was in, and Canada looked good. And not to say they didn't look good. They played their best way, and they looked good in the pre-tournament. But then came around the real round robin, and this is where it sort of got a little bit sticky. And you go and play Latvia, a team where, frankly, you should be beating a team like, yes, Latvia had a really good year, but you should be beating them every single time. A 3-2 shootout loss in this one. And, I mean, this was a game for the Canadians that they had their opportunities. They just kept doing the same thing over and over and over again. And it became to a point where, for this Canadian team, it was a disaster. And they did it again and again. Sure enough, Latvians ended up capitalizing on their chances, forced overtime in the eventual shootout, and they won in a shootout, which, of course, any shootout you get to is going to be a coin toss. And I think as much as, yes, this Canadian team against Latvia was the first of a red flag of many at this tournament, I think you look at the way Latvia played throughout, and I think in many ways, yes, you lose to Latvia, but Latvia was a good enough team that they very well could have pulled off an upset. You even look at their quarterfinal run where they nearly upset. And I think that's the trick for this Canadian team was, yes, you lose one game, but you got to flush it. You got to come back out ready to play. And we just didn't see that. And you come to the next game where the Canadians beat Germany 3-0. But this was a game where it was really a 1-0 game. You get a weird bounce leading to the second goal, and then all of a sudden you get the empty net, and that's your 3-0 win. And I think for this Canadian team, this was, in my eyes, the biggest red flag game out of them all. And as much as, yes, you lose to Latvia, if you bounce back and you smoke Germany and then you go and you beat the US, you right the ship pretty quickly. This outlook on this tournament could have been very different. And the response in this Germany game was evident that they didn't have what it was going to take to win this tournament. And I think you look at it, Germany as a team plays very similar to Latvia, plays very similar to the Czechs, which we're going to see in a couple minutes here. But the Germans played exactly as they needed to win. They just missed on a few key chances, which very well could have shifted the tide and very well led to another Latvian-type game. So I think for the Canadians, this third game, in my eyes, was the most telling of the tournament, that this team wasn't going to be able to compete and probably wasn't going to make it as far as originally thought. And you looked at their pre-tournament, they looked really good. They cleaned house in many ways, and then it just didn't really carry forward. And this Germany game, in my eyes, was the biggest red flag of them all. as far as the way this tournament was going to play out. Yes, they got the win, but then they're going to have to play a tough team in the U.S. And this U.S. team, I mean, yes, your eventual gold medalist, but they were one of the teams that I thought was going to be more of a limp in this year, and not necessarily the blow it away U.S. team that we saw the year prior, but they still played exceptionally well, and all the weight is for their gold, absolutely deserved it every step of the way. And I think this U.S. game on New Year's Eve against the Canadians was the pinnacle of what the U.S. had to do to win this tournament. And the Canadians just never really, in my eyes, got into this game. And the U.S. probably should have won by a few more goals. And, a penalty here or there could have very well swung this game. And I think you look at the way the U.S. played, that's the way that they needed to do it the rest of the way. And for the Canadians, they just got beat by a team that, frankly, played better than they did. And I think when you look at it, for this Canadian team, that was one of their biggest blemishes of this tournament, was they just struggled to get going. And I think that game was sort of the white flag, if you will, going into the quarterfinals, where guess who we're going to see again? It's going to be our friends from the Czechs. And sure enough, 4-3 loss in the quarterfinals against the Czechs. And this was a weird game too, where just lackadaisical performances, especially early in this game, where for the Czechs, they go up early and there's not much of a fight back from the Canadian team. And it's like, okay, here we go again. But sure enough, Canadians rally back, and then the late goal from the Czechs sort of secures it, where another tournament year where the Canadian team just falls short at this tournament. And it's going to be interesting next year, obviously, with the new coach coming in. What's it going to be for this Canadian team? Are they going to be a contending team at this tournament? Or are they going to repeat another year of quarterfinal exits? Or who knows, maybe even relegation, because I know that was thrown around early at this tournament. But sure enough, it's going to be an interesting tournament for this Canadian team at this year's World Juniors to see if they can be the team to really pull it off and in many ways right the ship for the last 2 years of disappointing performances. So for the Canadians here, yes, a disappointing tournament. They finished fifth at this year's World Juniors, but I think there is still hope for next year's tournament. You look at all the players at the Junior Summer Showcase, and I think you look at sort of this, I think it's 17 first-round picks or whatever it might be. You're going to get some NHL talent as well, because likely not going to be playing in, or maybe not NHL talent, but NHL caliber players. So I'm very curious to see what this next year's juniors team could look like, and I think it's going to be a really good showing for this Canadian team to see if they're able to pull it off and eventually win gold. So I think that's the expectation for the juniors. We'll talk a little bit more about next year coming up in just a little bit, but that's sort of the kickoff start for this Canadian team at this year's international season. And I think we looked at it, it kind of carried forward a little bit, a disappointing end or a disappointing start for this Canadian team. We'll get to the disappointing end in a little bit as well. So that'll do it for our World Juniors. We'll now shift over to our women's U18s, and this was, of course, in Vanta, Finland, where the Canadians coming in were expecting gold. And you come to these kind of tournaments, especially on the women's side, you expect a gold medal or bust. And I think in many ways for this Canadian team this year, it was very similar. And, you kick off an early win, a 6-2 victory over the Slovaks. You follow it up with a 5-1 win over the Swiss. And then you beat the Czechs 5-0. And that's a pretty dominant round robin, taking the first spot in the group. And I think it kind of carried forward into the quarterfinals, where you end up with a 17-0 win over the Japanese. And I think it was 76-4 were the shots, or something along those lines, where it was a dominant performance by the Canadians. And that's the kind of performance you want against a weaker team like the Japanese, where you roll into the semifinals against another tough team in the Czechs. You know it's going to be a battle. And yes, you might have beaten them early in the round robin, but you know that when the playoffs roll around, and you've already seen the Czechs knock out the Canadians once at a tournament in this international season, you know it's going to be a tough game. And for the Canadians, They played exactly as they needed to win. Was it their best performance? It was okay, but I wouldn't say it was their best performance, but enough to get the win and move on to the gold medal game where you go up against the U.S. and a 3-0 win to secure the gold medal for this team. And I was really impressed by this performance by this Canadian team, and not necessarily the favorites, although they had a really good roster of players. I thought, between the U.S. and the Canadians, those are going to be your 1-2. And sure enough, I think you could throw the Swedes in there as well. But for the Canadians this year, they did exactly what they needed to secure the gold. And I thought, in many ways, it's a really good stepping stone, especially when you look at what's to come in these women's worlds, where a lot of the Canadian team is starting to age out. And we're going to see an influx of younger players. We've seen it a little bit already, but I'd expect a lot more of it, especially as the years go on. You kind of look at this Olympic year, in my eyes at least, as sort of the turning leaf for this Canadian team. We'll see the old veterans have their run at another Olympic gold, and then I think we'll see a younger version of the Canadian team at the upcoming Women's Worlds from years on in. So it's going to be an interesting year, or an interesting year coming up for this women's side, at least for the Canadian team. But I think you look at what's to come, a U18 gold medal is very big, especially for a team like the Canadians, whose Women's World, sort of that national level team, is starting to age out. And we're going to see an influx of younger players, especially in the coming years. These are the kind of tournaments that you want to look for and you want to watch and see, yeah, this is the right trajectory for this team. So for the Canadians, a gold medal at the women's U18s, obviously in Finland as well. That's the kind of win you want to set the tone early for the women's side. And yes, there's no Women's World Juniors. But what I will say is these are the kind of tournaments where you want to see progress year over year. And a gold medal, whenever you win one, is a big step in the right direction, especially for a team like Canada. So that's what we got for the women's U18s. And now we will move to a non-IIHF event. That is the Four Nations face-off, of course, with Canada, Finland, Sweden, and the USA. And I think in many ways, this year's Four Nations face-off was more or less a preview for this upcoming Olympics in 2026. And this, in my eyes, was the redemption tournament, if you will, for this Canadian team at this year's international season, because coming in, you knew whatever this result was going to be was going to set the tone for the Olympics. You have all the star players from the NHL playing in this tournament, and it was going to be good. It was going to be great. And it was in Montreal. It was in, of course, Boston as well. But it came to a point where it was going to be an interesting tournament. Lots going on in the political world as well. That kind of fueled this tournament between the Canadian-U.S. rivalry. And you knew that it was going to be a really good tournament. And I think you look at the entire tournament from an outside perspective, looking back on it, and it really set the tone for what was to come at this year's Olympics. And I'm super excited to see what's to come, especially you look at sort of kind of the key storylines from this tournament. The goaltending from the Canadians. Was Binnington going to be enough? And I think you could say at the end of this tournament, it could be dicey, but he looks good enough to win. For the U.S., arguably their best team they've fielded in years. Are they going to be good enough to contend for a gold at this year's Olympics? Absolutely they are. And you look at some of the other teams like Sweden and Finland. Are they going to be contenders? And I think you look at the Swedes, they lost a couple key games in unfortunate fashion, of course, in overtimes. And that's one of the reasons why you look back on this tournament and say, well, did that change? That could have been different. If that changed, that could have been different. And I think for this Swedish team, they're also going to be looking for a gold medal as well. And I think for the Finns, they're always a tough team to play, and they're never a walkover team just because of the structured way they play hockey. And I think that was one of their biggest things that they can carry forward to this year's Olympics, where they're going to get a couple players from their own Finnish elite league to kind of aid in that structure. They could be another dangerous team as well. We didn't get to see the Czechs, so they're another team that kind of fizzle in and out of those tournaments. the Swiss can always be dangerous. The emergence of teams like Latvia and Austria, and Denmark even, we've seen at the men's worlds, could always be interesting. So I think when we look ahead to this Olympic year, yes, some of the teams aren't necessarily in it that we've seen from the storylines from this year, but I think when we look at this tournament, it's a competitive tournament where, frankly, a lot of teams can come in and win that game. So for the Canadians, this year's Four Nations face-off, in my eyes, kind of puts them as the front runners for this Olympic year. But in many ways, it could go either way, because that's the beautiful part about this sport, is it all comes down to if your goaltender can be hot. If you get rid of Binnington in that gold medal game, it could have been a very different result. But let's go into it. Starting, of course, with a 4-3 victory in overtime over the Swedes on opening night. And I think for this Canadian team, we play the Swedes, and the Swedes are always a team where you can't let them back into games, and you get off to an early start with the power play goal, with a beautiful power play goal at that, right? And I think for this Canadian team from there, it was about shutting the door down, and they kind of struggled with that a little bit. Obviously, they let the Swedes back into the game, forcing overtime. Then you have the Marner winning goal. And I think this was kind of a reminder for this Canadian team that they're not going to blow teams out, especially at this tournament, but also when we go to the Olympics, that not every teams aren't going to be walkovers. They are going to fight back at some point. You just got to be ready to fight that. So I think when we think about it, from that perspective, it was a good wake-up call in many ways for this Canadian team, that they're going to have to play a full 60 minutes if they wanted to win, not just the opening 20. And it was further reinforced by their game against the U.S. And, you kick off that game with 3 fights in the first 25 seconds. You knew it was going to be one of those types of games, just with everything going on in the world. But you add to it, and you add all the other stuff, and you add it all together. And it was a great game of hockey, but for the Canadians, they struggled to get stuff going. And I think, once again, you have to play a full 60 minutes. Doesn't matter who you are. You have to play a full 60 minutes if you want to get the result you want. And sure enough, for this Canadian team, unfortunately, they didn't quite get it done. So I think when we think about it, right, that's what it's going to come down to for the Canadians, is can they play full 60-minute efforts for the entire tournament, especially at the Olympics, but especially in this tournament as well. We saw it where it's all about the 60-minute efforts. And then you go when you play the Finns, and, you go up early. Deja vu all over again. The Finns creep back, but the Canadians put them away. And I think that one there was kind of the, hey, we got this now. We know what we're doing. We're going to be able to shut the door. And as much as that game was way too close as it was, the Finns come back within a goal and then you get the empty net, but could have went either way to the very end. And I think then you go to, of course, the gold medal game against the U.S. in Boston this time. And that game was as tight of a game I think we've seen in international hockey in a very long time. And it wasn't one team was dominating. It was teams trading chances at both ends. Either way could have taken that game with any lucky bounce, if you will. But it all comes down to leaving the best player in the world wide open in the slot. And of course, if you put it on his stick, he's gonna score that goal. So for the Canadians, they get the gold at this tournament, and in many ways, they set the tone for the upcoming Olympic year. But we'll talk about the men's worlds as well. But I think this year's Canadian four-nation team, their goal was to win gold, but also to set the tone for what's to come. And I think they set a decent enough tone. I think teams like the U.S. set a better tone for what to expect. And I think a team like Finland, where not expected to do anything, frankly, they were the underdogs at this year's tournament. I thought they set a pretty good tone of what was to come, where we might not be compared to you on paper, but we're going to play a rough and tough game. We're going to play structured hockey well enough to eventually stay within and beat you if you can't find that decisive goal. So teams like Finland, teams like Sweden, teams like the U.S., I thought they all set pretty good tones for this upcoming Olympic year. The Canadians, I thought, were okay. I thought they've had better, but still good enough that I'm not going to complain about it, especially with the gold medal taking this tournament. once again. So that'll wrap it up for our Foreign Nations coverage. We'll now flip down, of course, to the Women's Worlds. And of course, we have that little break in March. And then we flip now to the April tournaments. And you got April to May, our final stretch of the season, the international season. And we start here with the Women's Worlds. Expectations at these tournaments for any team, but especially for Canada and teams like Canada and the US, always year after year, is it's gold or bust. And unfortunately, that's just kind of the way that you have to look at it for these Canadian teams. And with the emergence of teams like the Czechs and the Finns in the last few years, I mean, you even look, of course, back in 19, where the Finns scored the winning goal, got called off, and the U.S. ended up taking that year. But for the Canadians, they were disappointed by that result because it wasn't gold and it certainly wasn't silver. So that was arguably the most disappointing year, I think, at this tournament for the Canadians. But every year, year after year, expectation is gold, and gold or bust, and even silver, I don't think cuts it anymore for this Canadian team. So we'll hop into it, of course, the game by game, starting with a 5-0 victory for the Canadians over the Finns. I thought this game was good enough from the Canadians. I wasn't overly thrilled, but I thought it was a good start to this tournament for them. They followed up with a 4-0 win against the Swiss, and this game I wasn't as high on. I thought the Canadians could have and probably should have won by a lot more, but, you know, a win's a win in the column. You can't complain about it. And then they go and they play the U.S., and it's going to be a tight checking game through and through. This game, once again, was tight, but unfortunately, the Canadians just found themselves on the wrong side of it. 2-1 loss, as they will be handed their first loss at this tournament. But then, you know, you get the bounce back game against the Czechs, and the Czechs played well, don't get me wrong. But for the Canadians, they played their game, and they were able to win playing their game. So I thought this was a really good performance, especially against on home ice as well, but arguably against one of the better teams at this tournament, where you follow up the tough loss against the U.S. with a bounce-back performance. And that's what we kind of missed, especially you think about some of the tournaments, and we'll get to as well, but for that World Junior team where you lose against Latvia. Yes, the U.S. and Latvia aren't really comparable, but you lose against Latvia, you need a really good performance coming off that game. And we didn't see that against the Germans, but I thought that for the Women's Worlds, that's the performance you needed to kind of get yourself back on track. And then, you know, you go and you play the Japanese, and this game, in my eyes, was just a frustrating game for the Canadians. Yes, they win 9-1, great, but you look at this game and you actually break it down, and I think it was 2-1 10 minutes into the second, and those are the kind of games that you need to blow teams out, take them out early, because you let teams like Japan stick around, they're going to battle their way through, and the longer they can hold on, the more belief they get, and eventually it's going to burn you. And luckily, it didn't in this one, and then we'll talk about the Finland game here in a second, but same sort of thing with the Finnish game. And it's another, you know, I think it was 2-1 as well, 10 minutes into the second, where you even let the first goal in from the Finns. And I think that's the one where you need to find your groove early. And yes, they end up winning that one 8-1 as well, but it all comes down to how well you can play for the full 60 minutes, but you also have to play the first 30 minutes. You can't just play the back 30 minutes. And then you go into your game against the U.S. in the gold medal game, and this game, I mean, it's a Canada-U.S. gold medal game. It's expected to be close. It's almost expected to go to overtime, and a 4-3 win off of an errant pass behind the Canadian net, ends up in the back of the net. That's your gold medal winning goal. But I think as much as this one it hurts, it's close enough that you're going into your Olympic year. You've kind of split with the U.S. these last 2 years. I'm not terribly concerned about the result, but I do think that as much as you want to win this tournament, it is about the 2026 Olympics. And if you can win the Olympic gold with the team you have, and I think it was good enough at this year's tournament where for this Canadian team, I think it's good enough to win the gold. You might see a couple younger players inserted into the lineup, but I think you're going to see a pretty consistent team from this year's Women's Worlds to the 2026 Olympics. So as much as, yes, you don't win gold at this year's tournament, I think you're close enough. You're playing against a tough U.S. team. You're not expected to win all the time. It's going to be a coin toss just like always. But I do think that this one could go either way, especially in the Olympics where we see the U.S. sort of resorting to a younger version of their team. Of course, for the Canadians, they're going with a very more veteran approach. So we'll see which one eventually prevails in that. So that'll wrap it up for our Women's Worlds. We'll now move on to the men's U18s for this Canadian team where, I mean, this Canadian team, I think you could make an argument for a top three with the Swedes as the clear number one at this year's tournament. And the U.S. and the Canadians, I thought, were going to end up second and third in some capacity, just the way the rosters were constructed. And we'll jump into the games. Of course, the 9-2 win over the Slovaks to kick the tournament off, a 7-1 win over Latvia, a 5-1 win over the Finns. And the Finns are always an iffy team, if you will, at these kind of tournaments where sometimes they have their game, sometimes they don't. If they have their game, they're dangerous. If they don't, typically going to be a little bit easier. And then you finish the round robin with an 8-1 victory, taking the top spot in the group. You then play the Czechs, and the Czechs were a very tough matchup for this Canadian team where they seem just to have their number in the sort of the counterattack pressure mode where Canadians made a mistake, it kind of come back down their way, and just seemed like that was the consistent factor. And we know well enough, on the men's side especially, the Czechs have been a dangerous team, and we've seen the emergence at the juniors these last 2 years where they beat them out. Of course, at the U18 tournament as well, where the Czechs have always been kind of a dangerous team you have to keep an eye on. You can't count them out. And sure enough, this one was no different. A 3-2 win, though, in overtime for the Canadians. They move on to the semis, where they played the Slovaks. I thought they played a decent enough game against the Slovaks. They weren't, I wouldn't say it was their best game, but I thought it was good enough to take the win. And obviously the Slovaks, once again, are a team who plays a very structured game. And we've seen North American teams struggle with that sort of trap style. And the Slovaks play that way. And I think you look at the 4, you look at the 0. I think the 0 is much more important for the Canadian team rather than the 4 because it showed that they're going to defend. And you're going to play arguably the best team at this tournament. And you need to keep that team off the board. And you come in against the Swedes and you beat them 7-0, which I think everyone was shocked. And not necessarily in the fact that the Canadians won. I think it was the way the Canadians won, at least for me, which was the most surprising. A 7-0 win over Sweden to take the gold medal at this tournament. And I think you look at the way the Swedes were constructed this year. And yes, it's the classic joke about how the Swedes choke every year, but this tournament quite literally was the Swedes' tournament to lose. And sure enough, in the gold, they just couldn't seem to get anything going, and the Canadians had an answer for just about every opportunity that they had. And I thought that for this Canadian team, this was a good stretch. And you look at what's to come. We talked about it a little bit with the women's side, where it's all about the U18 tournament. Obviously, there's no juniors, but we kind of see a little bit of a, I don't want to say like a trajectory, but like a trend where the U18 team sort of confuzzles into the World Junior team. The World Junior team kind of confuzzles into the national team. And I think for this year's U18 team, you look at what's been happening in the juniors the last few years. And I think the win against the Czechs is good. I don't think it matters as much as the gold medal does. But the way that they beat the Swedes at this very end in the gold medal game, I think, for me at least, was a sign of hope for what's to come. And for this team, I think it's a really good stretch and is a really good tournament for the Canadians to show that, yeah, we're going to stick around, especially at the juniors, where you may even see some of those players coming up. Don't be surprised, of course, to see some of those players from the U18s at the juniors. So for the Canadian team, a big win, sort of a trajectory setter. Hopefully we'll see that result carry over these next few years at the juniors, and of course with the Olympics coming up not too long as well. So that'll do it for our U18s. We'll now move to our final tournament of the year, which is the Men's Worlds. And this year's Men's Worlds was, I want to say, disappointing because of the expectations coming into this tournament. You look at all the players that headed overseas to Sweden and Denmark, and I think as much as they lose this tournament, I don't place a big emphasis on this tournament as a Canadian fan, just because I know a lot of the top players aren't coming over. But this year, you send a lot of your best players overseas, and not all of them, not going to say it was their best roster they could have constructed, but good enough that this could be a relatively Olympic comparable. And we'll talk about the Danish team in a second, but I think when you look at it, you were expecting something big from this year's Canadian team. And you kick it off with the 4-0 win over Slovenia, and that game, I mean, wasn't great. Wasn't terrible, but I thought it was a decent enough result that, hey, you might have a chance at this tournament. You follow it up with a 7-1 win over Latvia, and it's like, okay, this is the kind of result we're looking for, because this Latvian team was a good team this year. They weren't sort of throwaways right to the very end, and they had their chance to win, to knock themselves into the quarters. And I think that as much as, yes, it was an interesting game for the Canadian team, I think you get the win, you move on, 7-1, you go and play France, you get the 5-0 win against France, a 5-1 win over Austria, and this Austrian team was a tough team this year as well. Then you go to the quarters, you blow out the Slovaks 7-0, and which I honestly, or sorry, not the quarters. You continue in the prelims here with a 7-0 win over the Slovaks, which I honestly thought was the best game that the Canadians played at this tournament, with maybe the exception of their game against the Swedes. But I really liked this game against the Slovaks, where they just seemed to have every single number of the Slovak team. And then you go, of course, into the game against the Finns, and it was bound to happen. It really was that the Finns were bound to lose, or the Finns were bound to beat the Canadians, because it's just kind of the way that they play is very tough to play against. And we talked about it a lot on this channel. I'm sure I've said it a couple times already, but the trap style causes North American teams to have problems. It's just the nature of fact. And so I think when we look at it, this loss I wasn't that surprised with. As much as, yes, it's a tough loss for the Canadians, I wasn't throwing alarm bells up. I wanted to see the response. And we talked a little bit about it with the response throughout this tournament, where you lose a game, it's about how you bounce back. You lose to Latvia, you put up a stinker against Germany in the juniors. And then, of course, the Women's World, you lose to the U.S., and then you put up a real impressive performance against the Czechs. And I think this tournament here, where you go up against the best, in my eyes, the best team at the tournament between Canada, the Swedes, I think you could argue for 1 and 2. They go and they play I think their second best game outside the game against the Slovaks, but you could argue for their best game against the Swedes, and they win 5-3 in somewhat of a thriller. And I think on home ice, it's always, or on opposing ice, where of course Sweden's on home ice, I think it's a tough game to win, and you go out and you play a really impressive game and you get the win. And then of course you play the fourth spot in Group B, and the Danes were a team that kind of swiped their way in. They weren't kind of that, they snuck in. And you play that game, I think you play that game 9 times out of 10, the Canadians win 9 of them. It's just the fact that the Canadians let the Danes stick around for too long. You get 2 goals in the last 3 minutes of the game, and sure enough, that's all that she wrote. And a 2-1 loss against Denmark in the quarterfinals spells the end for Canada at this tournament, placing them 5th. But I think it was more the way that they lost, which was the most concerning. I mean, they didn't play great. I'm not going to say they played great, but they didn't deserve the fate that they did, I don't think. It was a tough loss. They deserved to lose, absolutely, but they needed to find that one goal to kind of set them apart, and I think this game would have been very different. So for the Canadian team at this Men's Worlds, yes, you win the big one at the Four Nations, kind of setting the tone for the Olympics. The Men's Worlds is another one where you're setting the tone again, and especially against some of the European nations, I think more than anything is where teams like the US and Canada, who kind of send their more or less B teams out there to play at this tournament, it's where you see the European teams and sort of see where they rank upon each other. And I think we saw teams like the Czechs kind of take a step back this year. And I'm going to be very interested to see at this Olympic year, because this is going to be my favorite Olympic year since, of course, the years that they got rid of it. And it's been a while since we've had the NHL players, the best on best talent. You're going to hear a lot of that these next few weeks, but it's all about how well this Canadian team can play at the Olympics. And you can throw away every Men's Worlds if you want to. It all comes down to the Olympic year, because that's your best on best. So it's going to be interesting. And I'm excited to see if this Men's Worlds is going to carry. I hope it doesn't as a Canadian fan. But I am interested to see whether or not this Men's Worlds tournament is going to carry more weight than, say, the Four Nations, because obviously the Four Nations was the best on the best, at least for the NHL's sake. And then for the Men's Worlds, it's kind of, I don't want to say the best of Europe, but for the most part, the best of Europe against kind of a weaker Canadian team. But still, this year's Canadian team was no joke, and I don't want to take away from that, because Canada sent some of their best players over, and it's not very often that they do, but this year, you see Crosby go over, and sure enough, everyone else kind of follows there, and you have McKinnon there as well. And I think those are the kind of players that you're going to look to on the Olympic team, that you need a goal. Those are the guys you're going to go to. So for Canada at this year's tournament, yes, a bit of a disappointing end, I think. You put the expectations on them as well. Of course, Denmark on home ice, the eventual loss to them. But I think overall, it was a decent enough tournament for this Canadian team. You beat the Swedes in the round robin on home ice. That in my eyes is a big win. You can't beat the Danes. Oh well. The Finns were a tough team this year, and so I'm not terribly upset with the performance. But I would, of course, have liked to seen them win gold, especially with the team they had. But that'll do it for our tournament-by-tournament breakdown. Now we'll go to our final recap, where, of course, we will see the juniors. We have juniors in the Men's Worlds. We have 2 fifth-place finishes, 3 gold medals this year at the Four Nations, the U18s for both the men and the women. And then the Women's Worlds was a silver medal, which I'm going to give Canada here a B+. I was fighting with it, and yes, it was a disappointing year, but you look at it in terms of expectations. The juniors in the Worlds were unfortunate, and I am not terribly happy with I'm still very upset about the World Juniors performance. The Men's Worlds, I'm okay with, just because they ended up winning the Four Nations, but the Four Nations was, in my eyes, the big one as far as what contributes to the grade being as high as it does. Silver medal, yes, it's a disappointment, but it's still a silver medal at arguably the top tournament on the women's side. And then gold medals into U18s and the men's U8 for both U18s. I think that they deserve a B+ just because of the gold medals. You take out the U18s, say we're only looking at kind of the major tournaments. Yes, I know the U18s are both tournaments, but you look at the big 3, yes, that grade's probably dropping quite a bit lower, but I think you add the Four Nations win, you add the 2 U18 golds, it just kind of boosts them up a little bit, which is why we end up with a B+. But I think overall, not the best year for Canadian tournament hockey, but still good enough that that they deserve a grade as high as a B+. So that'll do it for our 2025 recap. We'll now talk a little bit about the 2026. And as far as the 2026, Canada will be in, of course, the juniors, the U18s, both Olympics, the Women's Worlds, which still yet to be announced, likely going to be coming sometime in October at the semi-annual congressional, if they will even play that tournament. But if they do, that will be that tournament will be Canada. You'll see them in that one. Then of course the men's U18s and the men's Worlds. And so I think when we look at it for this World Junior coming up, I think this year's World Junior tournament is the big one for Canada, not only necessarily in the fact that they need a win, but I think we're going to see whether or not they can right the wrongs of years past. And yes, it's a lot of pressure. Yes, you have the new coach, but at the end of the day, it falls on you to see what you can do. This Canadian World Junior team is going to be deciding on, and I think in many ways it's going to be dangerous, but you need a win at this tournament. So we'll see what the new coach can do. It's going to be an interesting tournament. I think gold's still the expectation, but you really never know at this tournament because anything can happen. Then to the women's U18s we go, as they will look to defend their gold on home ice. I think that'll be one that I think in many ways is another tournament where Canada expects to win gold at. And I don't think I'm crazy in saying that, but that's kind of the expectation for this Canadian team, I think, at this tournament. And then we move to the Olympics. And I think the Women's Olympics, it's gold or bust as well. Very similar to the rest of the Women's Worlds. The Men's Olympics, I think, once again, is also gold or bust. I think you'd be happy with a silver, but I think gold is still the expectation. You look at the other teams that are going to be in it, right? You're going to see the evolution of teams like the Swedes and the Finns. You're going to see teams like the Czechs who are going to come out a little bit out of left field, but I think they're still a team that has a chance. We saw them win the Worlds not too long ago. The Swiss are always a tough team as well, and I think they're another one where very well could go either way. Another one's the Slovaks, where they didn't have a lot of their players sent to the men's Worlds this year, so we didn't get to see what they were fully like. And that's another team where they could be interesting, as well as teams like Germany and a team like Latvia, where not necessarily your favorites, but once again, it's going to be an interesting Olympic year. Stay tuned, because we will, of course, have full coverage. And one other thing, I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but we do have all of our playlist links from all these tournaments in the description below as well as our last week's episode for the US as well. We will have all the other ones coming out as we do our 19-part series, so stay tuned for that. And then we go to the Women's Worlds, where similar to the Olympics, I think it's gold or bust for the Canadian team. I will be curious to see, kind of depends on what happens if they decide to go with an all-college team. That could be an interesting route for this Canadian squad, especially on the Olympic year, where the PWHL season is going to be in there as well. So we'll see kind of what goes on there, whether they try and push it down to the end and sort of group it alongside the men's Worlds. That could be something to keep an eye on there. And then we go down to the men's U18s, where I think this U18 team, once again, is Canada's looking for gold. We saw it at the Hlinka Gretzky, which just wrapped up. Yes, they didn't win, but I think they showed themselves well enough. And you look at the star power on that team, and I think in many ways they're going to expect to win gold, and I think they have a pretty good shot at this year's tournament. And I think that's going to be another tournament where it is gold or bust for them as well. And then finally to the men's Worlds, and I think the men's Worlds, right, it's in Switzerland, but I think it's going to be another tournament where depends on who gets sent. Obviously on the Olympic year too, it's going to be interesting to see which other countries send players. But I think for the Swiss, this is their year to really kind of make their mark at this tournament. They've been sniffing it the last 2 years, obviously losing to the Czechs and then the US this past year. But I do think that this Canadian team is always a contender at that tournament. Just you look at the star power they have. Whoever gets sent over from the NHL is only going to help in that. So this is another tournament, once again, that really could go either way. But that is going to do it for our coverage today. If you like to drop a like, if you like subscribing, tell all your friends down below your thoughts on Team Canada. Until next time, see you.